Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over conditional statements in JavaScript. This comes after we went over Boolean statements together in a previous video. We're going to make extensive use of that to see how conditional statements work. Conditional statements are going to allow us to ask questions of JavaScript and the computer and allow us for the first time to actually branch out our code into different kind of segments so that our programs can actually do different things depending on what questions are true or what questions are false as our code kind of evolves throughout the program. Super excited to go through this. Let's get right into it. Okay, so I've created quite a few drawings for this one, as I think this is especially one of those topics where without the visuals it might get a little bit confusing. So we're going to flip back and forth between doing some code and then going through the actual visuals as well to really cement this idea. So to start, conditional statements allow us to ask the computer a question. That really is the premise of what conditional statements are. Just like we learned with Boolean values, we can evaluate a statement and then get back a Boolean value like true or false. A conditional statement kind of takes that a little bit further and allows us to kind of branch out our code depending on what the value of that question actually ends up being. So for example, in this drawing you see that I have a few lines of code at the top and then this drawing here right below it. Let's look at this code to start together right up here. So I have let happy equals true. So I'm creating true, pointing the variable happy at true. So happy is going to be true. Then I'm asking a question here. This is the new construct that we're learning in this video, which is conditional statements. We're asking JavaScript, hey, if happy is actually equal to true, then run this code inside of these curly brackets. And if it's not equal to true, then don't run these code inside the curly brackets. It's really as simple as that. So if you were to kind of take this and turn it into a flowchart of sorts, you would actually get this diagram down here. First, we would have this question being asked, which is the blue diamond. Is happy true? In this case, it is true because we started it up here. It's true. So it is true. So we go through this yes branch and we end up console logging this string here, which says yay, which is this line of code inside of the curly brackets. So pretty simple, hopefully. The syntax for this we're definitely going to have to get used to over time with the kind of way that the brackets work and the curly brackets and how you can write many lines of code inside the if statement. However, the premise really is asking a question only if that question is true. In the case of an if statement, entering the what's called body of the conditional statement, which is in this case one line of code, which is console.log yay. Okay, so let's flip back to actual code and look at another example just to really cement this in. So open up Visual Studio Code. Let's create a file for this. Let's call this if statement.js. I'm going to create a variable slightly different from what I created with happy. Let's just say let's go points equal to 10. And let's just ask computer a question. So to do that, we have the if statement, and then we're going to use regular parentheses to actually contain the Boolean expression that we want to evaluate to see if it's true or false. A lot of other languages allow you to kind of eliminate these parentheses. However, in JavaScript, it is mandatory. So let's say if points are greater than 5. Then what we want to do is open up a set of curly brackets. And the placing of these doesn't really matter. I like to create the first one on the first line and then kind of the last one on a separate line and leave some space in between to write my code. Generally, it really is a personal preference thing. This is probably the most common way to go about it. In real life, when you're working on teams, what will eventually happen is it's not really going to matter what your opinion is. There's going to be a program that actually runs through your code anyways and formats it according to what the team agrees on. So that said, let's write some code in here. Let's say console.log you have more than 5 points, just like that. Okay, so I'm going to pull up my terminal here and I'm going to run adjust to this file. So I'm going to make sure I'm in the right folder. I'm going to use node and I'm going to say if statement. And you can see that it actually prints out this statement, right? So what's happening again is creating the number 10, pointing points at it. So points is 10. And we're asking the question, is 10 greater than 5? So if you look at this Boolean expression, this is going to give us true, right? So this is going to evaluate the true. If it's true, then we enter this body right here, line 4 in this case, anything between these curly brackets, okay? If I add another line in here just to show you what happens, like let's say boo, right? I would actually get both of these printed out because this is the true case. So we can add as much code in here in between these curly brackets, but it has to be in between these curly brackets. Anything outside these curly brackets is not going to run when this is true. Okay, great. So let's go back to our drawings. Let's add some complexity in here. The main difference with this next diagram is that we actually have another line of code that's being added. So these first lines of code right here are the same as the previous diagram. We're saying let happy be true. We're asking the question, is happy equal to true? And it is equal to true, so we're going to actually print out yay, just like before. However, now we have this console log all done at the very, very end of the code. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind here when you're looking at this is that this line is actually after this curly bracket right here, right? So remember how I said it'll only run the code inside the curly bracket when it's true, which is the case. However, in this case, this code is outside of the curly bracket. So does that mean it doesn't run? Well, not quite. What actually happens is this flowchart down here. So let's go through it again. Just from the start, we're asking, is happy true? We know that it is true, so we're going to come over here and we're going to console log yay. Once that's done, we're going to hit this closing bracket, and then we're kind of done this conditional stuff. And we kind of continue on with our lives in the program, and we continue executing whatever code comes after it. In this case, we're console logging all done, and we do see all done being printed out. So regardless of if it's true or false, actually, in this case, what happens is all done is always going to be printed out no matter what the status of happy is. The main difference here is that if happy was false and we failed this check right here, so if we had false checking with true, which is false, we would not see yay being printed out. However, we would still see all done being printed out because it's always going to be printed out no matter what the status of happy is. It's completely independent of this conditional statement here because it has nothing to do with the if statement. It's just in the program in general. So regardless of yes or no, all done is going to be printed out. Only if happy is true is yay going to be printed out. So we're either going to get both of these printed out, or we're only going to get all done printed out in the case of happy being false. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to modify this program slightly, and I'm at the bottom of this, I'm going to console.log all done, just like this, and save the file. Okay, so if I clear this out, in this case, let's quickly go through it before we actually run it. We know that this code ran before, right? Because 10 is greater than 5, which gives us true. So we're going to see, at the very least, you have more than 5 points and boo, right? However, this code right here, line 9 in my case, all done, we do expect this to be printed out, right? Because this is kind of independent. This is outside of this set of curly brackets right here. So it has nothing to do with points whatsoever. So regardless if points is true or false, or in this case, regardless of what points value is and this statement evaluating to true or false, it's going to be printed out. So let's confirm that. If I run this, you see that we get 3 lines of code being printed out. We get you have more than 5 points, boo, and then all done. Curiously, if we change this statement to evaluate to false, let me get rid of this comment line so that we don't get confused in the video. If I say is points greater than 50 now instead of 5, what's going to happen is 10 is not greater than 5. So this is going to be false. We're going to get false here. And we know that if this is false, we skip to the end of the curly brackets. We do not execute this code inside of here. We only execute it in the case of an if statement if it's true. So we will not see these 2 lines printed out. However, we will still see all done being printed out. So that should be the only thing being printed out in this case. And if I run that, we'll see that that is indeed true. Okay, let's keep going with this. It turns out that we do need one extra thing really to make this work quite well when it comes to control flow. We're missing kind of one keyword, and that's this keyword right here, which is the final thing that we really need to learn when it comes to conditional statements for the most part. In this case, I've added this new keyword, which is called else. What this does is this takes care of the case when the first check is false. Okay, so let's run through this together just to see how it works. So we still have happy being true. We're asking the computer, is happy true? And it is true. So we're going to console log yay. The computer is going to totally skip this else, because if this code runs, it doesn't need to even look at the else clause, because it's only going to do either this or it's going to do this. It's never going to do both. So the flowchart for this looks like this down here. Is happy true? If it's true, then we're going to console log yay. If we were to change happy to be false at the start, then this conditional here would actually fail and it would be false. So false equal true, that's false. And we would actually have to execute this else block. And since we have an else block associated with this if block, it would be executed like so down here. So if happy is true and it's not true, if it's false, no, we come down here and we only print out oh no. We do not ever print out yay in the case of it being false. So in this case, this is kind of a binary thing. We either go left or we go kind of right, if you want to think of it that way. We either enter the true case or we enter the false case. That is the way to think about if and else. If is the true block, else is the false block. So let's actually code that out together just so we can see how that works. I'll make a new file for this. I'll say if else statement.js. We'll do let points equal to 10. Oops. And we'll say if points is greater than 20, we'll console log you have more than 20 points. And then we'll this time add an else. And you'll see that I like to add the else kind of right after this closing bracket on the same line, with the opening bracket being on the same line. So the same thing with the if statement. This is a personal preference thing. Some people like to do it like this. Some people like to do it like this. It doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that you are consistent and that eventually your team is consistent, and a program will usually end up editing this for you anyways. You can get extensions in Visual Studio Code that format this every single time you save the file, which is what I have installed, and that makes your life a lot easier, so you don't really have to think about formatting things. So that said, let's put a statement in here. I'm going to say if points is not greater than 20, we're going to enter this else block. Okay, so that means that if it's not greater than 20, that means you have less than 20 points, right? So I'm going to say you have less than 20 points. Okay. So let's run this file. I'm going to do node, and I'm going to say if else statement. And you see that I'm going to get the else clause in this case. We're never going to see both of these print out at the same time. There is no case where both of these can run at the same time. You either have this be true or it be false. In this case, it's false because 10 is not greater than 20, so we go to the else clause. If I change points to be, say, 30, and I save that and I rerun it, you'll see that I get the true clause, which is you have more than 20 points. Okay. If I do a console.log down here and I say all done, oh my goodness, try to think of what that would do. Try to remember, is this associated with this if else condition in this case? Do you think this has anything to do with points, right? In this case, no. We would always get this run no matter what. So in this case, if I run it with this being more than 20 and passing the test, we get this run, and then we get this run. If I switch this around and I change this back to 10, you'll see that I still get 2 things being run, but in this case, I'm going to get the less than 20 points and the all done still being run. So anything out here kind of in this region outside this if else block is always going to run. However, with the if else block, it's only one or the other. Okay. Now, let's get a little bit funky with these conditional statements. It turns out that we can add more complexity onto this so that we can check for more cases and kind of get a bit fancier with the kinds of questions that we can ask. Okay, so for this example, I switched it up a little bit. Have kind of some variables to allow us to do some different types of conditions. So we have the number 20, and we're pointing the variable score at it in this case. Now, what you see here looks almost the same as what we've seen before, but a little bit funkier. So let's be a bit slow with this and not rush. We have an if statement, which is what we've seen before. This is simply asking, is score greater than 30? It is not in this case. We have 20. 20 is not greater than 30, so we need to kind of continue with the code. In this case, we have an else if statement, which actually is not a typo. It is a way to actually kind of manipulate the flow of control in the code slightly differently than just an if else. This is very different from an else block. The computer will check if there's an else block and run that if this check fails. However, in this case, since there's an else if block, that's what it's going to check next. So if score is not greater than 30, it's going to jump down to the first else if block in this case, which we only have one. However, we can chain many of these one after the other later on if we want to. It's going to ask, is score greater than 20? This is almost like another if statement. In this case, score is not actually greater than 20, it's equal to 20, so this would also actually fail. So we would actually not get either of these statements printed out in this case. We would only get this all done being printed out because it comes after this conditional block of code. So if we were to flowchart this out, this is what it would look like. We would ask, is score greater than 30? If it is, we would print this statement right here. You scored above 30, which if I scroll back up here, what is this line of code right here? Interestingly, it's not going to print this ever again. Once we've gone into one of these if blocks, whether it's an if, else if, or else, we would not execute anything else in that conditional block. We can only do one thing in here. In this case, if it's greater than 30, we would do that, but we still print all done because that comes after all of the code in the conditional blocks run. The interesting case is when score is less than 30. Which we come over here where we're actually asking another question, right? So that's what this else if statement is. And this is different from an else because else catches everything. Else if allows us to scope down the question once again, but after checking this first question. So if we fail this test, then we go to another test and we get a chance to ask another qualifying question. So in this case, we're asking, is score greater than 20? If it was, we would come here and we would console log your score is between 20 and 30, because the only way you could end up here is if you were not greater than 30, but you are greater than 20. But we would still also print all done. So both of these statements would be printed out. However, in this code here, we fail both of these tests and we don't enter either of these blocks. So we only print out all done, which means that we go no for greater than 30, we fail that test. We go no for greater than 20, we fail that test, and then we come down here this way and we print out just the all done coming down the right side. Okay. The interesting thing here is we can actually keep adding more and more of these else if blocks one after the other so that we can ask more and more questions all in one kind of line or set of conditional statements. So let's look at what this looks like in actual code. If I create a new file, I'll create this if else if statement.js. These all sound very similar to each other. Let's use a similar example. We'll do, actually let's do slightly different. Let's do health. We'll say your health is 40. Imagine you're playing a game or something. And we'll say if your health is greater than 50, then we'll say, we'll console.log. Let's just say you have more than 50% health. Imagine 100 is a max, for example, and this is some kind of game. We'll say else if health is greater than, let's just say 20, then we'll say console.log you are running low on health. I'll explain why we can make this comment in a second, but I'll show you some kind of weird behavior that we'll get even with this code. And then we'll console.log, we'll just say game, I guess we'll say over. It doesn't make sense in this case, really, I guess, because maybe you continue playing, but we'll just go with this example for now. So let's run through this before we actually run this. We start health at 40. Health is not greater than 50, so we will not enter this line right here. We will not run line 4. We're gonna have a chance to do another check here, because if this one fails, then we can keep going through and checking until we get one that passes. Else if is health greater than 20? Actually it is. 40 is greater than 20, right? So then we actually run this code right here. We're gonna run you are running low on health. Then we're gonna run game over, because that's gonna run no matter what. So let's confirm that. I'm going to else if run this in Node, and you'll see that we get the you are running low on health and the game over, right? So we get this line and then this line, which runs every single time. If I made my health 60 and I run this, you'll see that I have more than 50% health and I'm getting game over still, right? So I'm actually entering this line of code because I'm passing this test. I will not run this else if, because I can only enter one of these in a conditional block, okay? I do get this again because this happens every single time this program is run, no matter what happens. I want you to think really quick, what is something weird about this code? When would this code kind of behave strangely? All right, if you gave that a think, you might notice that what happens when we actually are neither of these tests passing, right? So if we are not greater than 50, but we're also not greater than 20, let's test that out. Let's say that we have 10 health. What would we expect to happen in this case? We would fail this test, so we don't see this printed out. Then we would check this statement, and we'd fail that too, so we actually don't print that out either. And then we just print out game over, right? So if I clear this out and I run this again, you'll see that I only get game over, right? So this is where this actually fundamentally is different from the else case. In an else clause, without an else if the first one failed, we will always get the else clause, right? But in an else if, it's not guaranteed to always run. It's very similar to just doing another if statement, right? So this is actually very useful, but also takes a while to wrap your mind around and to see why this is actually used until you actually start running a bunch of code. One thing to keep in mind though, is this is different from having two if statements, one after the other, okay? I want to show you what's going to happen. If I delete this else, and I just have if health is greater than 20 like this, and I try to run this code, I want you to think what's going to happen real quick. Okay, once you get that a thought, let me change this to 60 health again. And if I run this, you'll see that something weird is happening now, right? I'm getting more than 50% health being printed out. Then I'm running low on health and then game over, okay? So the odd one out here is this statement is actually still running, right? So that's the difference between allowing us to have an else if in JavaScript and just an if. An else if can only go if there is a previous if that it attaches to. And these are always mutually exclusive of each other. They're totally, not independent, but mutually exclusive. So if this fails, then we can see this one, right? If this passes, then we would never see this one. And we can chain these else ifs together as many as we need. Okay, let's go through one final example here. This one is pretty much the same as the other example, but I've added the else clause. Okay, so we have an if here, we have an else if here, and then we have the added else clause here. Okay, and we still have the all done. In this case, the else clause is going to run any time the if or the else ifs fail. Okay, so we're guaranteed to basically get something printed out from this series of conditional statements because there's an if and then there's an else. All right, so in this case, score is 20. It's going to fail this test. Is it greater than 20, which is the next question? No, it's exactly 20. So it's going to fail this else if test too. But since we have an else now, this is basically a catch-all. Everything that fails any of the above tests, it's going to catch. And we're actually going to see printed out you scored less than 20. In this case, I should say less than or equal to 20. So technically that's a bit of a typo. And we're also going to see all done as well printed out because that happens every single time. So if we were to look at this flowchart, this is kind of what it would look like. And this gets quite interesting. We enter the program here and we check, is score greater than 30? If it is, we log this single case right here, and then we log the all done because that's going to happen no matter which case we go through because this is independent of this conditional statement. Okay. If score is less than 30, then we're going to go and ask another question just like before. We're going to ask, is score greater than 20? Which means it's between 20 and 30. If it is greater than 20, then we're going to print what we printed last time, which is your score is between 20 and 30. However, if it's less than 20 or equal to in this case, then we're actually going to come over here and we're going to go to this no case. And this no is going to catch everything that is less than or equal to 20 in this case. Right? And we're going to print that you scored less than 20, or should say less than or equal to 20. And we still get the all done being printed out as well. All done is going to be printed out no matter what in all three of these cases. All right. So the way to think about this is we can have an if statement by itself. We can have an if with an else if we want, with no else. We can have an if, else if, and else, just like this. We can have an if and an else. What we can't have, though, is just an else with no if. That doesn't really make sense. We also can't start something with an else if, because the idea is you have an if above of it, right? What we haven't seen, though, yet is that you can have multiple else if chained together. So we can actually take this part in the middle and keep adding a bunch of else if, else if, else if questions in between the if and the else clause. Okay, so let's kind of take a look at this really quick. If I added an else in this case, and I printed out console.log, and I'll say you have less than or equal, so very long statement, equal to 20 health, just like that. And if I was to run this with 60 health, I have more than 50% health, game over. So I'm entering this clause because this is true, game over being printed out. Let's do, I guess, 25 or something like that. In this case, I would be less than 50, but greater than 20. So I would expect to get you are running low on health, and I do, with still game over because that's independent and outside of all this. And now if I'm less than or equal to 20, let's say I'm at 15 health, right? And I run this, I will get you have less than or equal to 20 health, game over, which is now correct. So now this behaves correctly because this else is actually catching anything that fails this else if. Just to show you the case where we have multiple else ifs, if I wanted to kind of add more conditions here or even here, what I could do is I could just add another else if, right? So I could say else if health is greater than, let's just say 30, just like this. And I could take this console log and I'll say, let's say greater than 30, you have, let's just say between 30 and 50 health. Just like that. You can see that when I save my file, as I mentioned before, it automatically reorganizes my code. So this works because if I fail greater than 50, then I check this statement right here. Is it greater than 30? I have a chance to run this code. If that fails, then I'm going to check here. And if that fails, this catches absolutely everything. So you can see how this kind of cascades one after the other. We can check all of these else ifs one after the other, and then finally, if we have an else, we can execute that in the case that everything above it fails. We don't have to have an else clause. You technically don't even need an else if clause. You can only have an if clause. So you can have kind of any combinations of these for the most parts, just not an else by itself and not an else if by itself. Okay, so if I was to run this and I say 35 health, for example, which is between 30 and 50, you can see that I have between 30 and 50 health as expected. Okay, so that was quite a lot to unpack. There's definitely quite a bit of complexity, especially when you're learning this for the first time. There's a lot of new syntax, a lot of brackets everywhere, just kind of a lot of stuff going on and logic to keep track of. So definitely practice with this and change numbers around and change things around to see how you can make it do things that are unexpected or confirm that your kind of expectations are on point. If you want more practice, what I've done is I'm going to create another problem set video for just this concept of conditional statements, like our previous problem set videos, where I'm going to go through a bunch more exercises to get more practice and hands-on with this concept. We're going to start with some basic questions and then move over to some more complicated questions for practice. Then once we're done with conditional statements, we can move over to the next concept, which is going to be loops. If you enjoyed this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you had any questions about anything that we went through in this video, please leave a question in the comments. I'd love to reply and get back to you with a more detailed answer to help out. Can't wait to get to both of those. I'll see you in the next video.